Everybody, very warm welcome, very warm today. Today we are having the second iteration of the Resonances series, which is a small program which is working with several topics of the triennial here in Fellbach. The first one we had on the 30th of June, and it was dealing with the topic of reparation and restitution. Where we showed a little film by Ariela Asolay, and today we are diving into the topics of property and responsibility. And we have two guests here that I'm very happy that they decided to be part of the whole thing. And Brenna Bhandar, she is not with us in person, but she's here on the screen and right now in Italy. And Voegele here right next to me. And yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Resonances series maybe and how it came to be and why Elke and me decided to do something like that as well. Because the thing is, in this exhibition is a lot of really rich and political and heavy topics that might not reach everyone directly, immediately. There is this resonances, and you can feel it when you enter the exhibition. There is a lot of things happening. There's a lot of energies in the room. There's a lot of discussion. And so we had the decision really early on that we want to do a program which is in a way channeling this a bit more and making it a bit more concentrated and also have a bit more of the discursive input that is also connecting some of the topics that are like global here to the location in Fellbach. So that's also why I'm really happy that we have some people here that are locals that might later on also engage with us and talk about the connections that might come after listening and engaging with the topics we are discussing today, which are property and responsibility or reliability. And yes, I'm going to introduce our two guests quickly. And then we're going to listen to inputs from them, and then we're going to join a discussion. Yeah, exactly. So I will start also with a little bit more questions about the property and like a kind of little introduction to the event. So we were asking to what extent were land attribution and the resulting claims to ownership implemented in their legal form with racist methods of dispossession, thus creating a subjectivity of power and entitlement thinking that continues to shape Western superior thinking about property and ownership to this day. What are cultures of property? What are legal foundations and what impact do they have on contemporary societies in relation to colonialism and settler policy, and also in that concerns especially to German colonialism, because I think this is a topic we don't really learn in school here. And these kind of entanglements, they're active until nowadays, so I think it's really interesting also to dive a bit deeper into this and see yes, what we can find here in the space of the Alte Kälte, but also outside maybe. Okay, so now I'm going to make it a bit shorter. Sorry, I'm taking too much space. Okay, Brenna Bhandar, who is with us here, is a reader in law and critical theory at the SOAS, University of London, and her research addresses property, law, indigenous land rights, and post-colonial and feminist legal theory. In her publication, Colonial Lives of Property, which was published 2018, she examines how modern property law contributes to the formation of racial subjects in settler colonies and to the development of racial capitalism, bringing together legal and social theories. Brenna has published widely in the areas, of critical legal theory, sovereignty and indigenous rights, contemporary disputes over ownership and property rights, amongst a lot of other themes. And maybe also, Brenna, I want to give you the chance to also maybe say 1-2 sentences about what you're doing right now or the last few months.
Sure. So I've been working on a few different things in the aftermath of the Colonial Lives of Property book. So one other project that came out after that was the book Revolutionary Feminisms, which was a book I co-edited with Rafif Ziada. And that book was a book of interviews of anti-racist feminist scholars. And in that work, I think it prompted me to try and do some work that was a little more grounded with different communities. And so one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is with a group of researchers and a First Nation in British Columbia, where we're looking at the history of dispossession of very particular parts of their historic territory. And then after mapping this kind of transactional history from the first dispossession till the present day, hoping to assist them in fighting to get their land back. So that's one of the things I'm working on right now, and then there's some other things, but yeah.
Thank you so much. We are looking forward to hear more. Okay, and then to the next one, Hannah Voegele. She's a political theorist and is currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Brighton about a theoretical historical thesis on modern property relations. She lives in Berlin and works and organizes on queer feminism, colonial continuities, and state critique, amongst a lot of other topics. Her dissertation explores how modern property materializes in and through gendered, sexualized, and racialized relations to others, to ourselves, and to our bodies. To do so, she examines the continuities of historical property regimes, particularly in the German context. And as a political project, and not just as an intellectual exercise, this has implications for an understanding of combating violent relations today, such as for feminist struggles against sexual violence or for bodily self-determination. I'm sorry. And maybe, Hannah, also you want to say something about how your thesis is going, what is maybe new questions that have been raising up on the way, and also some of the other things you're doing aside.
Thanks. Currently, I've kind of gone down a rabbit hole because I wanted to look at the history of feminism, and particularly what kind of feminisms historically have been interested in property relations as well. So that led me down the path of looking at, also socialist feminists in Germany from around the 19th, so the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century. And a lot of them look back to, for example, Engels' text, The Origins of Private Property, the Family and the State. And then I kind of try to explore where that came from, and that actually then led me, and this connects somewhat to the topics we're talking about today, to the way that text was based on anthropological research that was then from Northern America indigenous communities such as the Haudenosaunee. And that was my last few weeks have been trying to trace how all of these local and global developments, both of theory as practice, are connected to each other. And that was just my last few weeks. And apart from that, I'm organizing with a group of people trying to get the abolitionist framework, supporting the abolitionist framework concerning police and prison in Germany, called Ihr seid keine Sicherheit, so you're not safety, you're not security for us. And that revolves a lot around consciousness around the role of the police and prisons, and that obviously is also very much connected to ideas of property. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much as well. So now I think Hannah is gonna start to moderate the talk between Brenna and her, and both of them have prepared something for us. So please lead us to what's next.
Thanks, Nicola, and also thanks to everyone who came, and also for organizing the event, of course. And I think we're going to start with two little inputs. First, Brenna, and then I'm going to respond to it. And then we can converse, but everyone is welcome to participate. And if someone prefers to speak in German, I can obviously also translate if that's something that's wanted. I think, Brenna, the screen is yours.
Great. Okay. Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, great. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to Nicola for the invitation. I wish I could be there. She showed me a little bit of the exhibition a little before the session started, and it looks really fascinating. And I also want to thank Hannah for moderating and being in conversation together. So what I'm going to do is just read out a short talk that just sets out a few of the ideas that I explore in much more depth in the Colonial Lives of Property book, but also some ideas I've been working on since that time. Okay, so legal abstraction, and of course property is a legal abstraction, deals in forgeries, committing fraud on people who find themselves, not of their own volition, but through an uneven and combined mix of consent, coercion, and lethal violence, living within jurisdictions of European, that is to say, colonial power. We can think here about the current struggles over state-backed corporate extractivism on Indigenous lands. In a widely remarked upon instance of colonial capture, one of the leading judgments on Aboriginal title, which is to say Indigenous ownership of their lands in Canada, explicitly identified economic development and the building of infrastructure for extractivism as the kinds of things that can legally limit or infringe on Indigenous ownership rights, or what we call in Canada, in constitutional language, Aboriginal title. And indeed, this ample legal justification for infringing Aboriginal land rights has been at the basis of the violent state enforcement of an injunction granted to a private corporation intent on transporting oil through Wet'suwet'en lands in northern British Columbia. So for many years now, and you may have seen this reported in the media, it's been reported in The Guardian, for instance, in the Guardian newspaper, for many years now, and in an ongoing action that is continuing right now, Wet'suwet'en First Nation land defenders have faced militarized raids and arrests for asserting their jurisdiction over their traditional lands while they try and stop the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. So the Coastal GasLink pipeline is one of several very contentious pipeline projects in Canada that First Nations and Indigenous communities have been at the forefront, along with environmentalists, of trying to stop, because this is just expanding our fossil fuel infrastructure. And as you may or may not know, Canada, with its northern geographical position, is actually warming at a much greater rate than other parts of the globe. Perhaps one of the most significant conceits of legal abstraction as it operates in the field of property law is the separation of sovereign power, so situated in the public realm, the power of the state, from property ownership, which is hived off into the private sphere of law. Early modern theorizations of sovereignty prized the concept of sovereign power away from feudal relations of proprietorship, aligning sovereign power with the state and property power with the private sphere of relations between individuals in society. However, as we know, and we can think about Marx's critique of this fictional divide between public and private legal realms in his essay on the Jewish question. So we can think all the way back to then about how this separation of sovereign power and private property power, despite all of these critiques, there is still an undeniable relationship between the sovereign assertion of control over territory and the mechanisms through which the state organizes individual private property ownership. The concept of possession in one register, so that of the state, the colonial state, is taken as an analogy in another. And there's a rhetorical force of mastery and control that is deployed across many different fields of ownership. Sovereignty asserted over territory is conceived of in the same way as an individual owns his property exclusively. Moreover, it is clear that the power of the colonial sovereign to control land and territory has always relied upon the force of the individual petty sovereign or individual settler, who, with the backing and the blessing of the state, makes land waste in order to appropriate it. And I'm happy to talk about that in more depth, but we can see this relationship as being absolutely central between the settler colonial state and the individual settler or the petty sovereign in maintaining a certain regime of a racial regime of private property ownership. To take a different example, the Berlin Conference of 1884 produced an imperial rule book based in an international consensus that was limited to European public law and did not include any African societies. How does one investigate these forgeries of colonial law? That is to say, modern law. How does one represent the formation of common and civil law systems that were forged in both senses of the word through colonial encounters rooted in racial, civilizational myths, and also, of course, a will to profit that had no truth value for those dispossessed of their lands? Thinking through the specificities of abstraction as a mode of thought, as well as real social, economic, and historical processes that were central to colonial land appropriation, raises many questions about the messy and non-linear dialectical forces that produce particular racial regimes of ownership, ones that are created through forgeries of memory, meaning, and representation. Drawing on the work of Cedric Robinson, our question becomes how an unstable truth system comes to gain the appearance and power of a hegemonic system of meaning, yet one that remains vulnerable to the forces of resistance and rupture that confront it. The creation of a false distinction between the material world and ideal notions, like the fiction of property, for instance, and also the reification of concepts that are divorced from the political and social realities from which they emerge, all naturalize an order of individual private ownership. And in the domain of property, the legal forgeries that seek to cover up multiple and complex relations to land, to obscure forms of use that did not conform, historically speaking, to agrarian capitalist ideologies of cultivation, find expression in a wide range of different legal techniques. So one such technique that I explore at length in the book is land titling, and specifically the institution of land title by registration. And this system of ownership actually originates in some parts of Germany before an English land law reformer by the name of Torrens takes it to the colony of South Australia in the mid-19th century. And the system of land titling is that ownership is proven by having your name on a land title document that is then registered with a bureaucratic state-governed registry. So the imposition of systems of title by registration first occurred on a widespread basis in the colonies of South Australia, British Columbia, on the far west coast of Canada, and elsewhere during the mid-19th century, before being instituted on a national level in the UK, some 60 to 70 years later. The system of title by registration in English common law is seen as this great invention of the English common law. Well, they explicitly borrowed it from Germany, but then anglicized it. But what we see when we look at the history of colonialism is that this system of landowning was actually used on a much wider scale in the colonies before it was brought back to the UK. And there's a whole story about that. Of course, we can talk about more if that's of interest. But the commodity logic of property that rendered land as an equivalent to any other form of property provided the rationale for the creation of land title registries in the colonies. And it's significant that during the early to mid-19th century, registries, which function as a bureaucratic archive of legally recognized ownership interests, actually exploded across many different legal domains. So you had slave registries, registries for life insurance policies, and you had land registries. Now, the colony was conceived of by English land law reformers as conveniently free of a self-governing population with recognizable pre-existing ownership to the land, much like the views of the Belgian, the French, and the Germans present at the Berlin Conference. The drive to render land as fungible or as vendable as possible that had been pursued since the 17th century or even earlier in England emerged amidst the long transformation in which credit instruments and debt became central features of a globalized political economy. The colony, envisioned as a vacant place, a terra nullius, provided one site among many others for the emergence of legal, political, and economic forms that continue to shape our everyday lives. The racial and propertied abstractions that are encoded in the doctrine of terra nullius reflect a dual vision of property and race gender that continue to shape voracious forms of land speculation and increasingly financialized modes of real estate investment. Ones which continually reenact the appropriation of indigenous land, both in rural areas as well as the urban residential spaces or homes of informal occupants and non-owners. Property and urban planning laws, financialized real estate speculation, and their attendant tax regimes effectively materialize this jurisprudential fiction or illusion of an empty, uninhabited space. Colonial capitalist accumulation is continually recreated through a series of forgeries that traffic in the currency of legal fictions and abstractions. Representations of territory created by colonial authorities, created by industry, who assert their ownership in spirit and in fact, bear little, if any, relation to the lived relations of use and political organization that exist in the same space. The sheer complexity of people's struggles to get their land back, and in the context of urban spaces to hold on to adequate housing, have both been increasingly determined by neoliberal economic and policy frameworks driven by privatization, deregulation, and financialization. Financialized abstractions attempt to eviscerate the complexity of people's lived realities, their attachments to and struggles over land and urban space. It is no wonder then that resistance to both the inadequacies of the legal framework of rights and the violence of predatory and financialized extractivism have taken the form of collective action, and Hannah referenced abolitionist practices before, that utilize a wide range of tactics, from blockades and increased communal social provisioning to legal advocacy, to the assertion of indigenous legal systems and anti-capitalist notions of use and value. Excavating the heady mixture of negotiation, consent, refusal, and resistance that shape neo-imperial modes of rule is a way of revealing their vulnerabilities and their weaknesses, so as to claim the debts accrued through the violent processes of juridical abstraction. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Great, thanks, Brenna. I'll just follow up on that real quick with a little story, and I'm going to travel first to the German context, just to show how there's sometimes similar, and we've seen already entangled narratives and logics, and then also have a specific look at the gendered formations and relations that are formed within and through and for the racial regimes of ownership that Brenna has outlined. And I'm particularly interested to see what happens like in struggles over ownership, so struggles over land, over resources and bodies, and I'll focus on the concept of the family. And in this mode, or the idea of traveling or moving from one context to another, I thought we'd start somewhere close to here, so only 30 minutes by car. We find ourselves in Korntal. And Korntal and Fellbach are connected through several things, by one of them being biographies, especially biographies of priests. And Korntal was a community or congregation that was very closely connected to the Basler Mission, so Basler Mission, an influential Christian missionary society who exported and sent German missionaries into the whole world prior to, throughout, and beyond German state colonialism, so in the 19th and 20th century. And maybe that's a little tangent, but regarding that, it's maybe interesting to say that even though sometimes people say or stress that Germany only had a brief, if brutal, history of colonialism, this, if brevity is at all an interesting concept in that regard, is only true for state colonialism. So even before the Berlin Conference in '84, German actors from corporations, but also missionaries, were involved in other imperial endeavors. So the U.S. or North America, actually a lot of settlers came from Germany. So I think in the 19th century it was around 1 million Germans settling in the U.S. and German was for a long time one of the main spoken languages amongst settlers. I think that changed around the First World War. But anyways, point is that German colonialism extends way before and after the period of state colonialism. And so that is true for the missionaries, but also very much so for private corporations and businesses that actually also made way for German colonialism by buying up land and contracts like that, as well as being involved in the slave trade. But yeah, I don't want to go too far into that. But so if we travel to Korntal and back in time, we'll find the educational daughter institute, Töchterinstitut Korntal, where white German women would be educated to then sent out to marry missionaries in German colonies, as well as other mission placements in the whole world. And I'm only using this example for the local context, but also to stress that this practice of sending white women into the world to form white families and procure and reproduce white cultural hegemony as well as white ownership is not limited to religious histories, but rather within German colonialism it became an established practice organized by colonialist women. So these white propertied women did not stay inactive, but were really invested in forming a white collective and to support empire. And this was to avoid familial and kinship relations between the male settlers and the colonized women. So der Frauenbund der Deutschen Kolonialgesellschaft, or the Colonial Women's League, established an institutionalized program that sent white women in so-called girl shipments to the colonies. So there, in the language or form of a commodity, they were wed to form families and secure the survival of white settler society and its possessions. And whilst the women organizing this, so the Women's League's members, were part of the ruling class, the women shipped off came mainly from lower classes. So this somewhat alerts us already to a complex relationship that's also sometimes messy between, white women, property, and the ownership of self and body. So white women can appear both as a form of commodity as well as the owners of political might, and that depends on their class status or their property status. So the interesting thing is that we can see a specific grammar of property baked into intimate relationships such as the family. So with a social and legal infrastructure of ownership being built in the empire at large, this is also importantly based on social and legal regulations around the family. So while at the beginning of colonization it was custom for German men to gain access to property and trading connections through intermarriage with elite local women, this changed with the further establishment of settler society against strong resistance. So whilst at the beginning racial categories were not so strictly drawn and family relationships could be to the benefit of white colonizers, as it enabled forms of appropriation of land and resources, and many German settlers had been afforded access to wealth and social mobility through that. Later, intensified struggles over ownership led to clear drawings of racial separation, and therefore interracial marriage bans were quickly instituted. And especially if we look at Germany's first and foremost settler colony, German Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, and that's also the colony most people are most familiar with. Shortly after the turn of the century, and especially the genocidal wars against the Over-Herero and Nama peoples, racialized and gendered relations were strongly enforced through social, cultural, and legal instruments such as the intermarriage bans and also the exclusion of children of white and black heritage. So these marriage bans, how they are connected to property especially, is that it meant that property settlements were refused to colonized women previously married or somewhat engaged to white German settlers. So in the end, while legal relationships and familial arrangements were purged, the importance of sexual access to colonized women did not disappear, but rather remained part and parcel of ordinary colonial lives. So while avoiding the troubling family and property issues that ordinarily accompanied long-term sexual relationships, sexual access continued. So and this creates a specific sexualized and exploitative relations between colonizers and colonized along gendered lines to protect hegemonic ownership relations. And I'm gonna try to not go on for too long. The point is that this determination between who is allowed or the ability to own and to be an owner, or at the same time draws strict racial and gendered lines. So colonizers were confirmed not only as owners of land and resources, but also owners of others, their productive and reproductive capabilities. And this in turn determines who gets to count as human, as a mother, as a family member, as a citizen, and so on. And these struggles over hegemonic ownership relations play out in different ways in different colonies. This would go too far, but if we now look at what's today Tanzania or Cameroon or Togo, or go as far as Samoa, we'll find somewhat differently articulated versions of these legal infrastructures. So the point is, and I think maybe we can talk about that also after, is that the continuity or renewal of property orders takes a lot of different forms of violence to maintain. And I just want to quickly maybe move back to the current moment, and so the thing is that when we move through time and space, societies and their systems of categorization change through struggle, but past violences rarely remain in the past, but rather they live on in similar or differently articulated forms today. And when it comes to the idea of the white German family or racialized citizenship, this moved also from the colony to the metropole. So while these interracial marriage bans did not make it from colonial into national German law, this was not for lack of trying by colonial bureaucrats. And also, of course, this would change under the Nazi regime. But even beyond the specific legal constructs of the interracial marriage debate, notions of linking citizenship to race and familial descent is crucial in Germany and was also introduced into the German nationality law and furthered the ethnicization of citizenship issues. So until the 2000s, Germany's German citizenship law was basically only based on the principle of descent or blood, rather than the principle of place of birth. So this has changed a little bit, but still the principle of place of birth is only applicable under very specific circumstances, and we can see the continuities of that from the specific colonial context. And even beyond that, Germany still refuses to own up to its colonial past and presence. And if we just look at Namibia, the example that I've used throughout my short introduction, so the German-Namibian government recently signed last year a reconciliation agreement, but that was only negotiated and put into place between the two governments, and the legal term of reparation was deliberately not used to avoid the consequences that come with that regarding international law. And especially the representatives of Over-Herero and Nama people have criticized this settlement because neither were they allowed to participate in the negotiations, nor will the agreement significantly change the social setup. And importantly, the point is that at the moment, white settlers in Namibia, many of which are of German descent, own most of the land, while descendants of Over-Herero and Nama people are continuously dispossessed and pushed into native reserves. So there's, I think, around 4,000 white families, a lot of them German, who own almost half of the land in Namibia at the moment. And there have been loads of discussions around land reform, but especially German-speaking Namibian farmers claim that, their ancestors 2 or 3 generations before came here and bought the land under the laws of the government of the day. So that was quickly after the genocidal war, when land and property were confiscated and then sold on. Maybe I'll also stop here, and I thought we can now travel back to Fellbach, where we are now, and try to link it maybe to some different issues that are all entangled, so we can talk about, I'm not going to say what we can talk about, people can decide on that. I thought maybe I'll start with one quick question to Brenna, and from then we can move on to the discussion or open up questions from everyone here. And I thought maybe something that you also mentioned in your remarks, and I thought that also links to this moving from one context to the other. I thought it'd be interesting to talk about this notion of renewal, or the necessity for constant renewal of these regimes. So I think you also mentioned the question of how unstable truth systems can become hegemonic systems of meaning based on Robinson. And I guess it's always important to remind ourselves that contrary to what we might be led to believe, that property regimes or property in itself is neither natural nor self-evident. It needs to be reproduced constantly through many different ways. but that also means it can be undone or challenged or intercepted with through many different ways. And I thought maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question to bring up, and thank you so much for your remarks. I really enjoyed them, and there's so much to draw out of your comments. In terms of the renewal and necessity, I think this is a really key point, because in many ways it feels like, through my lens as a critical legal theorist dealing with property, it often seems as though there are particular forms of property that are making it very difficult for people to survive in many parts of the world. And the COVID pandemic is a perfect example, right? Where we had intellectual property rules and ownership over patents that have led to a catastrophe, right? We had many more deaths globally than we would have had, mainly again in the quote unquote third world, the global south, however we want to talk about the formerly colonized world. This is also because of patent law of the WTO rules that were never relaxed. We have a situation where we're all dealing with this prolonged crisis. That's just one example. There are so many examples, or we can talk about extractivism and fossil capitalism. We can talk about housing. I think what's very important about this idea that this is not inevitable is really important. And we can understand in a very concrete way, not just theoretically or conceptually, how these regimes of ownership are not inevitable by looking at the very real histories of alternatives that have existed, and we can think about how in the context of indigenous land ownership, which, not to romanticize indigenous land ownership, and there's a huge heterogeneity amongst First Nations in even just British Columbia, that's the westernmost province in Canada, never mind all of Canada, et cetera, but one thing we can look at is how many different indigenous nations have had alternate forms of landholding and relations to land, which have not put their exploitation as the highest and most prized form of value, right? And so, and these modes of landholding have been, not only were they in place for thousands of years before colonization, but even after encounters with colonial powers, many of these systems of land ownership were recognized initially or at some moments during this colonial encounter before really until like the late 19th century, when a lot of that, living with or, recognition or tolerance or however, we want to think about it, actually then was really eliminated. And, as Hannah referred to, some of these regimes then become much more solidified and legally regulated and regimented. So, that's an example. Or if we look at in the realm of housing, we can see in many European nation states how there were extremely strong protections around maybe not a right to housing, in some cases a right to housing, but we had a situation where even something that sounds banal, but very strong rent control or protections against eviction or tenants' rights. Protections of squatters. All of these things are in the very recent history, a few decades ago, which are very different from the current situation when it comes to housing in many cities. And so, these, whether it's the longer jure view of alternate forms of landholding, or a shorter term looking back several decades before the privatization and neoliberalization of housing regimes in cities, you know, it's very important to, I think, you know, acknowledge how these become, you know, captured or incorporated within something that is much more kind of punitive, a punitive system of exploitative private ownership. So I think that thinking about the instability of property regimes is really crucial for thinking about how to undo them. I mean, if I think about the work I mentioned at the beginning that I'm doing with this group of researchers in a First Nation, this legal, political kind of activism is based on the idea that Crown sovereignty, so the state's sovereignty over land, or its underlying title to land, is based in British Columbia on nothing more than the assertion of it. You know, so colonial authorities say, we have underlying sovereignty to this land. And then you have the Supreme Court of Canada acknowledging, on the other hand, well, Indigenous title, Aboriginal title was never extinguished. It's based on the fact that First Nations were here first before Europeans arrived, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that gives a right of ownership. So this paradox, you know, this something that actually doesn't make any rational sense, needs to be shouted from the rooftops more, to kind of push against the power of that colonial mythology, you know, that the Crown has a legitimate title to the land, which they don't, in fact. So not just morally, but actually legally and politically. The property regime in a settler colony is based on completely shaky ground. So, you know, I'm sure we can think of other examples in other contexts of that, but I think this is really important to think through, but also to act upon.
Yeah, great. I was thinking about a couple of things during your remark. One, maybe also something that we need to somewhat work with or reject is certain notions of temporalities, in the sense of when we look at alternatives that have existed or that do exist, oftentimes they're being positioned as in the past or as over. So that's also something that I was thinking through when I was looking at the text that I mentioned before, and like feminists' engagement with property. So even in the 19th, 20th century, when people were so Engels and the text that he was working with by Henry Louis Morgan was then based on Haudenosaunee indigenous societies, and they were so intrigued by different notions of property that were being lived, that weren't according to colonial, patriarchal notions of organizing society and private property not existing and so on, but they immediately positioned that as being over and in the past, and now we follow this linear history of progress and of civilization, where, you know, private property is one step further somewhat, and I think we can still often see that narrative being used, I guess, to discredit alternative forms of living together, like people claiming that in a certain scale of society it's not possible to live differently, or something like that. So that's something that I was thinking about when, maybe it of course, romanticization is not what we're aiming for, but at the same time looking at how these struggles have survived and exist in the very present moment still, I think is something that's really crucial. And I was just thinking about this notion of where people position history and continuities of colonial narratives and logics. And then I was also thinking about when you were talking about housing. Yeah, I also had a lot of ideas concerning how narratives around use and are being mobilized within housing contexts. So when we look at housing struggles, people try to reframe our understanding of using housing or other resources in different ways. So not for exploitative reasons, but for example, stressing how housing is something that people have to live in and use as a home and so on. But I don't want to go on. I'm thinking maybe we can also see if other people want or have any questions. Otherwise I can also think of many more questions to Brenna or just babble on. But maybe there's someone in the audience that has a question first, and I think we can maybe then pass around the mic if that's the case. Or maybe Nicola.
Anyone? Okay, so maybe not a concrete question, but like talking about this connection to land, and we had a concept here in Germany a long time ago of land belonging to not someone but to sharing it, and it's called Allmende. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe also I would be interested maybe in the Fellbach context of like, do you know anything about that, the people who are from here? Because that's also the thing, I was also thinking, of course, about Silvia Frederici's idea of the accumulation of body and land, and this idea that ownership is something individualized, that ownership of I don't know where I want to go with this, but just resonating what you were just talking about, and there's so many layers and so many topics connected, and I think also the connection that sometimes is not really clear to us, that this kind of things happened here before. Sometimes they happened somewhere else before, but also like we have a legacy of property problems here, I would say. And I don't know, like maybe somebody in the audience can just think about one connection that is affecting them, or I don't know, maybe we can take the conversation to a more like private level, or to a more like local level with this as well. And I can talk a bit more about the Allmende, because I think that's a really interesting thing, and that was like shared land that didn't belong to anyone but farmers, mostly farmers and peasants were using it. And after this whole change of the power of church and states here, this was taken away, and this actually led to a lot of problems, and people suddenly didn't have a place to go, didn't have work, were under the land that they shared together was taken away by the feudals and by the churches, and they suddenly had to pay to live on it, to work on it, to grow food on it, and to raise children on it, and to have animals. And some of them, of course, didn't, so it's a really long story. So I don't know, maybe there is some Fellbach stories about that, and maybe there is some stories about people not liking that and fighting back, because this is what you were referring. There is a legacy of these things that is most often not a public memory, or like it's connected to other stories that might hide this kind of public struggles, this kind of like revolutionist movements, this kind of abolitionist movements that are really going back to a long past, actually. So
it'd be super interesting to follow up. I guess probably about a lot of these things are also oral histories, and that refers back to like different understandings of how we archive things and what actually gets seen as legitimate knowledge about the past and the present. So I often think, this is a different story, but I often think all my grandparents are already dead, and I always regret not talking to them more about all of these things. So, for example, this is another story, in a way also a story of property, because my grandfather grew up in what is now Poland, because his father was a farmer and he was settled there by Himmler. So under the Nazi regime, Himmler was really into organic farming. So a lot of German farmers were settled in occupied Poland to do organic farming, and this is where my grandfather grew up as a child. Anyways, it's a different story, but I often regret not knowing more from that history, because when I look it up online, I don't really find that much about it, but that would be maybe one of the, not necessarily a story of resistance, but a very much a personal story of German settlement. And I think that's also something that's not really so present in German historical mind, how colonization did not only happen in Africa and the Pacific, but also very much so in the Eastern enlargement, as it was called. But yeah, we could probably fill many more evenings around that. But yeah,
I mean, I remember a little Fellbach story that was happening after the last event we did, when we went outside to go to the restaurant. We met the first mayor, he's called? No? Yes. Like there is a mayor above him, and then there's the first mayor. I don't know why it's called like this, but yeah, and we met him on the street on the bicycle, and he was actually talking to us about Fellbach being a city with a lot of workers and a lot of poor workers as well, that actually also went to the States. Like there was a big movement, a big migration movement from people settling in the States. Do you remember the time, Maya, maybe? Or maybe you know some more about that. 100 years ago, exactly. So there is these stories everywhere. It's just, yeah, sometimes you're not connecting these threads, I think. Yeah. And it's personal stories, it's family stories, but it's also, yeah, it's bigger stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that could also be another question that I thought about discussing with Brenna. You know, this connection between the local and the global, I guess, and then also the role of the nation state or the imperial state within that, because of course it's central when we look at like legal infrastructures, but at the same time we always see how this really exceeds national boundaries and also the national legalities, because of, I mean, the movement of people, but also the movement of ideas and of objects and so on. So I don't know if Brenna has any ideas of, how these connections from like very local developments to like global systems of law and the role of the state that's like super strong, but also always porous. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Yeah, I did. I was really enjoying listening to Nicola's explanation of that kind of mode of shared use. And just to say about that, I think there's all kinds of ways, you know, in the English context, for instance, about how very small threads of the commons history kind of comes through into the current moment. But also just, I think there's something about the way that people survive that involves a sharing of things and a sharing of resources. So, you know, it might not be following some kind of identifiable political form that, you know, we can sit down and analyze as academics or theorists or what have you. But I think that just in people's daily practices, in many different contexts, that the sharing and different concepts of use are absolutely crucial to people's sort of day-to-day survival. So on the question of scale, and the nation state, Hannah, which you also mentioned earlier, I think that's really it's a very important and interesting question to pose or issue to bring up for discussion. And the way I like to think about that question about scale, the one that you were talking about earlier, not necessarily addressing the question you just posed, but maybe it does, is I think about Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's work, And I think about the way she writes or talks about the state, when people want to simply criticize and criticize the state to the point, and she's, I think, also maybe thinking about certain anarchist positions, but she kind of posits the idea, well, what is the state? On some level, the state is us, in the sense of who makes up the state, right? And so these battles, like for instance, you mentioned abolitionist politics and defunding of the police. I mean, that's a really good example where that sort of organizing involves taking on one of the core functions of the state and then completely reforming it, not reforming in a reformist sense, but in a radical sense of restructuring it, rethinking it, and reorganizing it, right? So, I think that people who want to somehow ignore the state or, not think that we can somehow not engage the state I don't think that's a persuasive position to take. We can criticize the colonial state, et cetera, but, trying to break down the state capital nexus. So to take a concrete example, in Canada, it's fighting the fact that the government has bought out the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and is now, that's a state-supported corporate project. So, we must fight the state on things like this because, when it comes to that sort of fossil fuel overproduction and increasing the fossil fuel infrastructure, just so much is at stake. I mean, too much is at stake. So, I'm not sure if that quite answered your question, but.
No, that's great. Yeah, I was just, this is also a different notion, but regarding the state and also the legality of the state, I was just thinking Germany has just recently changed its constitution to include 100 billion for the military every year. And that's also one of the things where, also communal wealth, I guess, is being redistributed in a very specific way. Also to, this is, I could say so much about that, but that just made me think of that. So that can't be ignored because that will reshape our Germany and Europe for a very long time. Maybe also because of that, I was thinking about, and also when you were talking about the Allmende and the changes that come when you lose access to land, I was thinking that so often, or at least I also get the sense from talking to people in everyday conversations, property is very closely related to security or safety for people. So property is like one of the ways in, a chaotic and catastrophic world to make a safe space for you and your family. And I'm thinking sometimes, I've thought a lot about how to transcend that in a way, because I understand where it's coming from, especially when you have also history of dispossession. Sometimes I wonder how to get beyond that when so many people are just struggling with any form of safety in this world. But I don't know. This is maybe not the nicest note to continue on, but maybe Brenna, you have an idea, or I don't know, Nicola, if you wanted to add anything. No.
Well, it reminds me of that statement by Jeremy Bentham that, the raison d'etre of property is security, right? So, private property is about securing the sense of safety of people in a way. But I think that, that word security is such a rich word to think through, because what does security mean for the vast majority of people, right? It is having adequate provisions to survive and even maybe flourish. So it is about redefining these ideas of security as well, right? To mean human well-being, and having, we're so far away from that for most of the world's population, for not, for people who are not essentially at this point in time quite wealthy, so quite well off. So I think, I think it's not about kind of condemning people who are marginalized and excluded from this private property regime for so long and then come within it. It's about really trying to deconstruct the system itself, So I think that is one way of thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think it's so interesting how so many concepts that are so prevalent, like safety or security or freedom, and other like strong concepts in our societies, are so entangled in many ways with the idea of property, and how much work kind of needs to be done to disentangle that, and also to engage the imagination to actually be able to think about these concepts differently. This is also something that we're trying to do when it comes to the police, because so with this idea, ihr seid keine Sicherheit, you're not safety, or you're not security, because if you ask everyday people, the things that they say that make life safe for them is something like a house or secure income or something like that. It's very rarely that they say the police or the military or something like that. So I think in little ways like that we can also like shift conversations. But this is just a tangent, I guess. I don't know. Should we see if anyone else wants to say anything else, or close up the conversation? And what do you think, Nicola?
I mean, I think we could continue for hours and days, and I'm really happy to follow up on that at a later point. But I think maybe, I have one last thing that just circled around in my brain, the connection to debt and property that we didn't cross yet, and also the idea of debt in general, like because I think it's also a really fictitious idea. Somehow, I don't know, and especially I think in the States where this is reaching monstrous, purposes, and basically everybody is kind of indebted, but still owning or not. Like, it's a really fragile idea of property there, I think, as well. And then another thing with debt. Of course, it's the colonial debt that is to be circled into discussion again as well, because maybe that's also a thing that cannot be paid back. So this kind of idea of unpayable debt, and what do we do with this when we talk about another idea of property as well? But yeah, maybe that's also a way too big question now. It's just for me, like, the whole discussion in a way came together back also to the space here, the artworks that are discussing a lot of these questions too. And yeah, I don't know, maybe you want to answer, maybe we just leave it open like this and everybody is making notes, and we will continue at a later point. And I just want to give out a really, really big thank you. It was really an amazing, amazing thing to have you here and circle around these ideas. And I hope also for the people here and the beings in the space, the objects, they are with us somehow. And yes, I think this resonances today, I don't know, it hit me on another ground as well. I think it was really great what you both brought into the room, and it was so diverse and it was so how do you say that in English, like stringent?
Stringent, yeah.
Yes. So I think I'm leaving here with a big pocket of more questions and more conversations to be had. And I also want to thank the team of the Kulturamt Fellbach a lot for organizing all of this, the technical help. We have someone documenting here, and we of course have the brave people taking care of the space as well and taking care of the objects. So I just want to give a big thanks to all of them too. And also the people who can't be here today, which is Elke Ostemore, who brought together all of us somehow, and then I brought some other people, but you know how it goes usually. That's also another idea of like changing some things, I think, you know, to not do things alone and to not... But yeah, and yeah, of course I also want to thank a lot of the artists that brought in so much more substance into this whole discussion, with like dealing with it not only on a intellectual, academical and mental level, but on a really like engaged in physical and thought-provoking level. Okay. Maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I won't say so much more, but it's actually really nice to be in this space, and I got a little introduction to some of the artwork by Nicola before, and I think that, yeah, this conversation and probably also the film that you watched by Azulay, and then with all these objects or art pieces, depending on how you want to frame it. Yeah, I think that really resonates, and it also really fills up this space, and it's a shame that Brenna isn't here, but it's also been really nice to engage. And I mean, your question about depth, I think, could also follow up like a whole new discussion, but I liked just briefly maybe how you immediately had these two different ideas of it in mind. So maybe looking at, you know, student debt and all these like really crushing material realities, but then also a reconceptualization of debt maybe as like reparations or something like that. But yeah, I don't want to get too much into that. Yeah, I guess thank you for bringing me here. And I'll give it to Brenna.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. I agree we could spend several days talking just about the questions you ended off with, Nicola, about the comments about debt and then the specificities of colonial debt. And there's so much to say about that. And, you know, here in Lisbon, as I'm sure in many German cities as well, you can feel that this debt that can never be paid because it's built into the infrastructure of these cities, right? I mean, this is the very material world of these urban European sites that are built through, you know, the extraction of wealth and peoples from the colonial world. So anyway, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm very sorry I'm not there. It's always weird to do this on Zoom, but I'm also very thankful that we could do it, even though I'm not there. So yeah, anyways, thanks very much.
Thank you.